Our third speaker this evening is one of the world's leading thinkers on urban strategy and innovation. Jeb Brugman has worked in scores of cities and rural areas in 28 countries, and for 25 years he's been devising solutions to help local communities access the benefits of globalisation and to help global organisations engage with local communities. Jeb Brugman is currently Executive Director, Local Governments with Local Governments for Sustainability with ICLEI, that's the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives in the USA, which means he represents 585 American cities and counties. And he's also, as I mentioned earlier, the author of Welcome to the Urban Revolution, How Cities Are Changing the World. Jeb Brugman.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Melbourne. I've been in other Australian cities before, and for totally irrational reasons have never been here before and feel very at home. It's a wonderful place. Having said that, I want to admit that for a long time I was a hater of cities. We could have a kind of Alcoholics Anonymous for city haters. I come from a long Western tradition of people who feel alienated from the city. Our religious traditions from the Judeo-Christian tradition inform us that the city is a place of sin and evil, and if you want to have communion with God, you have to go to the wilderness. And I grew up in a rural area where I had the pleasure of the free range of nature. We had horses, and I spent my days riding horses over square miles, and it just so turned out that my father, because my parents divorced early, he lived in Manhattan, about 60 miles away, and on a regular basis I would go to visit him in Manhattan. If you've ever gone into the Lincoln Tunnel in Manhattan, it's a smutty, dark place, and at the time Tolkien's trilogy was very popular to read. It was like entering the gates of Mordor to go into Manhattan and visit my father. And on the other side of the bus station, it smelled of urine, and people seemed deranged and stressed out, and I couldn't imagine at all why anyone would ever live in a city, not to mention a terrible place like Manhattan. What an awful city. So, like most of us, I think, we struggle to feel at home in the city, and we live a split life, psychologically, if you'd like, spiritually as well, in terms of a sense of place for ourselves, for our families, we as a species. Rousseau and Enlightenment thinkers told us that the natural condition of humankind, again, was a pastoral one. And in my country, as part of that enlightened tradition, Thomas Jefferson told us that we should grow as a pastoral nation of small communities and small farmers. In the early industrial era, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we saw cities as the places of, again, crime and disease. And we invented something as a form of habitat in the mid-20th century, starting in the United Kingdom with the Garden City movement, to create a way of living that was close to industry and manufacture, because we needed to be close to it, but that wasn't urban. We created a suburb. And for more than 50 years, we've tried to come to terms with our schizophrenic nature and feelings about the city by perfecting the suburb as a way of living. And we have countries called Australia and Canada and the United States as evidence of that effort to live neither a rural life nor to fully embrace an urban one. And like most people here, we grew up in a time when the first space missions sent us some photographs of our planet. And the symbol of our time was this picture of Earth in space. You can picture it in your heads, I'm sure, of a planet with its blue seas and its ice caps, in some places green forests and its savannas, and grew up with this image that didn't have a city in it. at the time that we were voting with our feet by the billions to transform the planet into an urban planet. And I decided to write Welcome to the Urban Revolution as an attempt to sort of get over the imagery that we carry, the cultural tradition that we carry with us, that has us focusing on our escape from what we've created, the schizophrenic step towards the city as we retreat from it, and to try to embrace it as a natural habitat for our species. In 1989, I had a chance to meet two great scientists in the world. One is Dr. Sherwood Rowland. He discovered in the 1970s the depletion of the stratospheric ozone layer and traced the sources of it to some particular chemical CFCs. And for 20 years, he was blacklisted in his scientific community because industry worked against him. And in that year, he approached a group of mayors that I was involved with and asked us if we might consider in the United States phasing out these chemicals, because at the city level, through local laws, through local levels, because the first Bush administration would not sign on to the Montreal Protocol. And we found through some research that our cities, even the little cities, were the point sources on the planet of the emission of these chemicals. One city where we held a meeting with Dr. Rowland and a group of 30 mayors that started the establishment of ICLE in 1990 accounted for 1/800th of the global emissions of CFC 113. That was a city of 115 people. A tiny city, but because of its industry, its aerospace industry, was measurably accountable for a global environmental problem. And in the same year, I met Dr. Richard Hansen, the chief climatologist at NASA, who's been one of the great campaigners. He's even done civil disobedience to get the United States government to confront the problem of climate change. And my mind shifted in that moment when I realized that the city was not just the problem that we had to work on and solve, but was the habitat we had to create to recreate our relationship with nature, to come to terms with the global environmental problems that we have to come to terms with in this century, which led me to the Earth Summit in 1992 and all the preparatory meetings for the Earth Summit. And in those negotiations, I was representing the world cities, an unusual role. Cities had never been represented in these negotiations before. It's a long story. But time and time again, the governments of China and Brazil and India, they would float proposals that they wanted the Earth Summit to agree to a policy that we should stop the growth of cities, that we should send people back to the hinterlands, a belief that we could stop the most revolutionary event, I argue, that we've ever gone through as a species. Because while they were making these anti-urban proposals, there was another image of Earth that we could have been looking at, and it's that image that I think we all know now, the image of Earth at night in solar shadow, where you see the evolution of a global urban system that will shape our ecology, that has reshaped our politics, which underpins the thing we call globalization economically. That was taking place as nations were foolishly arguing that somehow we could stop it. If you paused long enough, you could hear the sucking sound of billions of low-income people making a totally rational choice that their future out of poverty was in moving from a village to an urban location. If you paused and thought for a moment about the changes in the borders in the 1980s and 90s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of apartheid, the end of Marcos, the Iranian Revolution, the civil rights movement in the United States that led to our urban migrants, the African Americans from the rural South, them taking over the cities of the United States and eventually being able to elect a president. If you pause long enough, you realize this is part of that revolutionary process. People came to cities, were marginalized in cities because elites thought that the cities were just for the elites. And what they did is they leveraged the natural economics of cities to build their own economies, their own politics, their own legal systems. They created parallel cities, as in Paris and in Nairobi more recently. And eventually they took over their cities. And they changed whole regimes, and they've rewritten political maps of the world. There are certain natural economies of urban settlement, and one of them we're most familiar with is what we see around us, economies of scale. How collecting people together and being able to make things big actually reduces the cost per person or per user of doing anything. And industrialization has been all about economies of scale. But there's another critical economy of cities, which has been referred to by both Rob and Patricia, economies of density. And we've been building our cities in denial of economies of density. Poor people understand economies of density because when poor people move to cities, and in my book I write at length about Asia's so-called largest slum, the slum of Dharavi in central Mumbai. When poor people are allowed to transform their slums into cities and create districts in which they develop their businesses and do manufacturing and educate their children and have their own law and have entertainment and create the diverse life that a city has to offer, they do that on the basis of economies of density. What they understand is that density reduces the fixed cost, it reduces the cost of achieving anything in a city, of moving water from house to house, the logistics of running a business. And so economies of density are fundamental to our being able to make the investments we need to transform our cities into cities in which people can climb out of poverty. The poor tell us that in slums around the world, but also to transform them into ecological cities. So we have to get over our denial not only of cities, but now our denial of the basic economics of cities. And the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States illustrates that denial. The subsidy of low-density urban development that started with the Garden City, this tradition of suburbanism, led to a kind of living for which the basic operating and maintenance cost was so high that average middle-class American households, and even upwardly climbing middle-class American households, they couldn't afford the full cost of it. And neither could the local councils that had to provide the infrastructure to service these communities. So while the history that's been written about subprime is a story of how bankers fiddled around and did derivatives and had some financial funny business, underlying this is the ability of borrowers to cover their debt payments. And the reason they couldn't cover their debt payments is because the cost of transportation, the cost of maintaining their expensive low-density properties, the basic costs of living in low-density settlement were much greater than their household budgets could support. And there are many studies now to support this, and I think we'll see a bit of that subprime history rewritten. So I think hope we've learned our lesson, and I've heard tonight the growing discourse about density being critical for our future. From an ecological point of view, density is essential to use the technology that's already been tested and we know is market viable to transform city districts closer and closer into the way the ecosystems itself function. They produce their own energy. They recycle their own energy. They recycle their own nutrients. That's the way our cities need to be built. That's what ecological urbanism is all about. Cogeneration systems, district heating and cooling systems, transit systems, water recycling systems. None of these are affordable until you achieve a basic density to create enough concentrated users in order to cover the basic costs of applying these technologies on a market basis. So strategically, the issue for us as a species is to accept that the city is our habitat, and in fact we've already chosen that, and what we need to do is just get on with it. Suburbanism was not a return to pastoral life. Suburbanism was an attempt to have both worlds, but I think in the future that we head into, in particular an ecologically sustainable future, we need to finish developing this global urban system and transform it into something quite different than what it is today. Now, Rob has mentioned, and I agree, that cities, although they're built of concrete and steel, are remarkably transformative things. That in periods of 20 years, we've seen cities, European cities that were declining areas, Dublin was mentioned, transform themselves into major centers of global business. In my own run-down old industrial neighborhood near the port of Toronto, it was the center of drug trade and the Hells Angels motorcycle gang 20 years ago. It has transformed itself through very much a community-based process and through an entrepreneurial process into the third largest film production district in North America, with local government only coming in towards the back end of that process. So our cities are incredibly transformative. We transform vast areas of land into new cities. In 20 years, in the United States alone, we urbanized a land area the size of the state of Florida, or the same land area as Greece or Nicaragua. Vast land areas are being transformed all the time. But the problem is that we transform them without our real engagement in them, without bringing our full intelligence to them. There's a global building industry that has figured out a limited set of products that it can reliably generate a profit from, and is more than happy to put a greenfield suburban subdivision down or build another big box shopping mall or another set of a high-rise condo district without the amenities needed to support it. So if you rely just on industry to deliver what it is, just like we rely on auto manufacturers to deliver automobiles to us, if we don't get engaged in the process and require innovation in the process, then this new urbanized land area continues to be highly unsustainable. And in the book, what I wanted to understand is, how is this that some cities could come from very dire circumstances and in a period of 2 decades, 2 or 3 growth cycles, could transform themselves according to very progressive agendas. Chicago, to maintain and transform itself into an affordable city for working class people, to recover low-income districts from slumlords that were being burnt down by arsons and rebuild its neighborhoods. Curitiba, Brazil, to transform itself as it grew as one of the fastest growing cities of the world, 6% per year over 3 decades, into one of the most ecologically efficient cities in the world. Barcelona, a city whose inner city old historic districts were collapsing literally every 3 days, a building collapsing in the early 1980s, into one of the most creative cultural cities in the world. What did they do? What they did was not to just open themselves up for any kind of investment, any kind of development, to invite this global building industry to bring the least common denominator product to them. They engaged as citizens, they embraced their city, and they created new urbanisms. They created a culture and a type of building and a way of living in a city and a way of debating over the city and a way of designing and investing the city together as a system, district by district, corridor by corridor, that was distinct to the purposes that they wanted to achieve in the city. And if you go to Curitiba, you'll live a kind of city life that you won't experience anyplace else. In Barcelona, the same. In Chicago, the same. They have a richness, a uniqueness to them that, as Rob has said, is the highest achievement of urbanism and urban development in the world. And what is fundamental to urbanism, be it ecological urbanism or a just urbanism, is the engagement of us as people, as agents, in embracing our city and building our cities up. So to conclude, our success as a species in this century, in the face of economic challenges and poverty on the one hand and ecological challenges on the other, hinges on us as Homo urbanus, us as people who have chosen our lives and anchored our lives in cities, to embrace them, that the cities are our garden. They are our enterprise. They are our purpose. They have to be accepted as our home, as the locus of our identity, as Patricia has said. We are Homo urbanus, and our societies will not thrive, and perhaps will not even survive, without a loving, intelligent embrace of the city and of our fate together as part of a global urban system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeb Brugman, who is the author of Welcome to the Urban Revolution. In a moment, I'll invite you in the audience to contribute to this debate. But first, a response from Dr. Cathy Oak, Councillor Oak, who's a member of the City of Melbourne, a councillor in the City of Melbourne and chair of Melbourne City Council's Eco Committee and Executive Committee member of ICLE Oceania. Cathy Oak, would you like to respond to our speakers? Thank you.
I'll try not to take too long because I assume you'll have lots of great questions for our panellists. But Jeb, I'd say I was disappointed that you didn't end your spiel about the new High Line project in New York. You know, you entered the evil or the horrible infrastructure that is New York, but what a claim to fame that community now has with the revitalisation of that disbanded railway bridge in New York. It's very exciting to see. And I also, the excitement at the end of Jeb's piece around the role of cities and what cities are doing around the world in terms of sustainability, social and environmental. It was my first sort of connection with ICLE at the World Congress in Edmonton, which is where I met Jeb originally, and just having hundreds of cities there with the vast range of challenges that they have from the developing countries and the developed countries, the small cities, the big cities, but hearing how they're addressing the challenges that we face was just so exciting and inspiring to be a part of. And I guess I mention that because one of the big things that's very important to ICLE, local governments for sustainability, is the importance of recognising the role of cities in the climate change debate, and that climate change debate is social and environmental, obviously. And our speakers tonight have described this very well. And one thing that ICLE is working hard on a global perspective, and I acknowledge Martin Brennan in the audience. Martin and I are working from an Oceania perspective to ensure that cities are recognised in the final agreement in Copenhagen. Jeb mentioned Rio, but the Kyoto Agreement doesn't recognise the role of cities in this debate, and it's going to be a great achievement for cities, local government and sub-nations to be recognised in the post-Kyoto Agreement that's negotiated in Copenhagen. And what that means to Australian cities, to Australian local government, to be included in that agreement is perhaps something we can discuss further tonight, but definitely a discussion at a later time. I know I'm not meant to summarise what everyone said tonight, but I did jot down, and I have to read my terrible handwriting, so apologies if I get it wrong, but I did note a couple of challenges and opportunities that each of the three speakers mentioned. Rob Adams identified, unfortunately, our large carbon footprint and the role that cities have in this large carbon footprint, but identified opportunities in local energy generation and the retrofitting of our buildings. And many of you have probably heard about the City of Melbourne's ambitious 1,200 building project. And in order for us to achieve that, we need to actually break down a few barriers, which I'll talk about in a second. I know I've got a short period of time. Affordable housing closer to the city and how important that is in revitalising cities in a cultural and social creative way is very important, and Patricia touched on that sense of place and thriving communities, and how important that is not only for having cities as creative spaces, but also for social inclusion and including our disadvantaged communities. But the opportunities there, Rob Adams definitely highlighted some great examples of when we create open spaces for everyone. It genuinely means that the cities are open for everyone, whichever background you come from and whatever elite class or not so that you're from. And I have mentioned a couple of the things that Jeb mentioned, but in particular looking at that global challenge, the global challenges that we face, but how important that old adage of local solutions are small-scale solutions in addressing those larger global challenges. A couple of final things I did want to mention. I was told that as a respondent I was allowed to maybe throw in a couple of things that were not addressed, or to emphasise a few things that were mentioned but I think are really important from a local government point of view in addressing our thriving, surviving cities. planning controls, in particular in Australia. Our ability to have control over large developments, especially in Victoria, is a huge barrier for local governments, many of whom we have zero net emission targets, and we have, or we'd like to see our cities as catchments, but unfortunately sometimes we don't have the ability to have full control over that, and I did applaud when Rob mentioned that desalination plant. Investment in local renewable energy sources is really important as well, rather than the one-sided investment in rather polluting energy sources. I keep getting told about this exciting opportunity of electric cars, and wouldn't it be great to have electric cars in the city in Australia, but until we have a low carbon energy sources, and particularly in localised areas, we're not really going to be able to see electric cars as the future that it could be, until we can provide those electric cars with a renewable energy source. And then there's finally, I've got two things. Priority of transport modes. Vancouver, when I was there in June, the most inspiring thing I noticed that from a planning point of view, over the last many decades, they've seen the priority of transport modes around pedestrians, cyclists, public transport, freight, and then cars. Imagine if we reversed that in Melbourne, and I think that it would make it a lot easier to make to make us a more sustainable city. And then finally, I think all three speakers did mention investment in social and community infrastructure and affordable housing, and how it may sound simple, but it really can, that we really have heard of examples that investment in social and community infrastructure, affordable housing, can lead to healthier, happier communities with a sense of place and a sense of purpose. And now I'll let you have an opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Councillor Cathy.